Hello, welcome to the Advanced Research Daily Academy podcast. We're talking about NFL here. I'm Big Italy 42. He is Scott Mail. We got Sports 25 to life, and he's going to be breaking down for you how to do advanced research in NFL. Obviously, everyone knows how to click and look at a player's game logs and look at the Vegas odds. All those things are easy, but we're going to show you here how to dig deeper and try to give yourself an edge in these contests. So, why don't you give us the breakdown here?
Yeah, you mentioned that we've talked about some of the more basic stuff in these other pods already, like projections and value, basic Vegas odds. We talked about cash game and GPP strategy also. As far as advanced research goes, one of the interesting things that I've found over the last couple of years has been player props. Not so much just what the prop is set at, especially in terms of touchdowns, but what you actually have to bet to win a certain amount of money is a really important thing when you're looking at player props. For instance, we'll use the example that I used in the post. In Week 6, DeMarco Murray had an over-under of 124 yards, which is obviously makes him a really strong play. And I essentially treat that as a projection of 124 yards for the most part, and kind of weigh that with what some of the bigger sites are projecting and stuff like that. But the interesting thing to note on that line actually is that the price to take the over on that line was minus 120, which means you have to wager $120 to win $100 if he goes over. Instead of actually setting the line at a higher and making it a much more even bet, they chose to set the line lower and price you into taking the over there. And so that makes him more likely to go over to me when a betting site makes it really pricey to take the over in that situation. And so you have to feel really good about a line like that. When it's at 124, and it easily could have been something like 135 in that scenario with 100 to win 100 bet or 110 to win 100 bet. When they bump it up to 120 like that, it generally means that I'm going to be looking at it as he's going to be over that total. And that's the biggest thing in player props for me, is to look at what the price you're actually paying to get that over is. So that's one interesting thing that I've found quite a bit in player props. A very similar thing with touchdowns. For instance, he was minus 150 to score a touchdown in that game, which means you're betting 150 to win 100 for him to score a touchdown, which is an absolutely incredible touchdown line.
Yeah.
So you got to feel really strong about that one. Anybody that's over 150, I generally consider a pretty strong consideration for a guy that's going to score a touchdown. Because if you're getting to 150, that means you're basically paying 50% juice, essentially, on him scoring a touchdown there. And so it's not a situation where I want to make that bet on the site. It's a situation where I want to take DeMarco Murray in a daily fantasy game is the big thing. So being able to read lines like that comes in really handy. Not everyone has player props. It's generally reserved for the bigger players. Calvin Johnson always has them. It's been expanding more and more over the years. I expect we'll see even more fringe-type players make player props this year, just because as the NFL continues to become more popular, and as much as they don't want to admit it, it becomes more and more of a gambling sport. There's going to be a lot more player props for everyone throughout the league. I mean, we're talking about, we saw some second-tier wide receivers get player props last year.
Yep.
I'm thinking we're going to get most of the wide receiver 1s and 2s throughout the league getting player props this year. Most of the starting running backs, all the starting quarterbacks get player props. So this is going to become a really useful tool as these player props become more and more popular, because the lines are going to get better too. And that's a big thing there. In addition to player props, we talked about this a little bit in cash game strategy, that all players essentially come down to opportunities and touches, especially in cash games. I used an example of a player's first 2 games of the season where player 1 had 22 targets, 11 catches, 173 yards, and a touchdown, compared to player 2 who had 14 targets but 11 catches on those 14 targets to match player 1 with 212 yards and 2 touchdowns. The more predictable player going forward is going to be the less productive one in that scenario, because he nearly doubled the guy in targets, and that's essentially what you're looking for wide receiver production. You can't count on anyone, no matter who it is, to catch 11 of 14 targets over every 2 games, especially to convert 11 of those catches to 2 touchdowns with a big yards per catch average of almost 20, it looks like, for player 2 here, where player 1 had a lot more sustainable 1 touchdown in the 2 games, a little over 16 yards per catch here, and 22 targets, which means he averaged double-digit targets in the 2 games. The big thing there is, like you mentioned, it's easy to look at game logs and see the 212 yards and 2 touchdowns and want to play that guy. Yeah. But looking deeper into it and going to an advanced research site that shows you targets and catchable targets and stuff like that is going to be a lot more valuable to you than just seeing the guy's gross stats, because we don't know how this guy accumulated these stats. He could have had 1 80-yard touchdown reception that really skewed these numbers big. He did catch 11 out of 14 targets, and catch percentage is great. But if anything, the guy that caught 11 out of 22 targets is probably on the low end of variance in catch percentage. So looking deeper into guys' lines, especially earlier in the season, when everyone just wants to react to the massive games like you see in season-long fantasy leagues every year, where there'll be that one random guy that catches 3 passes for 123 yards and 2 touchdowns.
Kevin Ogletree.
Yeah, there's a perfect example of it. There's always that guy in week 1 and 2 that has that massive game, and everyone chases after him and gets really excited about him, and then he doesn't do anything the rest of the season. Yep. So looking more at the advanced stats early in the season is a really big key to not only cash games, but GPPs as well, because you don't want to be chasing after something like that Kevin Ogletree game that you mentioned where he had 3 touchdowns against Washington really early in that season. You want to be finding the guy that's going to have 3 touchdowns next and not the guy that had 3 touchdowns already. And that's the big thing as far as opportunities go, because opportunities almost always lead to production, unless you're talking about an absolutely terrible player that's like been forced into action due to injuries. Yeah. And even in that scenario, the guy's probably going to be so cheap that his opportunity is just going to outweigh his overall talent anyway.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, all those things you said, we talked about in a couple of the other Daily Academy podcasts there, is you want to be the next guy to get the big production, not the last guy who did.
Yep.
So that's a great point. A nice thing that'll help set you apart in all your games, cash games and GPPs. So that'll wrap things up. Thanks for hanging out with us here. Check out all the rest of our great content for Daily Academy.